Smoking of tobacco is a huge public health challenge, but it's one where we have some harm reduction solutions, and I think that in the next couple of decades we're going to see quite a major transformation in the way in which we address issues related to smoking. Smoking has been increasing globally. There are perhaps 1 billion smokers in the UK. Great achievements in getting people to give up, but still around 20% of the population smoke cigarettes. Even on the most optimistic projections, the government only sees that coming down in little bits, maybe in the next 5 years, down to about 19, 18%. We've got strong anti-smoking campaigns, but what are we going to do with those people who continue to smoke, who are, for whatever reason, unable or unwilling to quit? We're really saying to that 20% of people, well, you might die. Now, that's perhaps a strong public health message, but it's a very unhelpful public health message when there are other ways that people might consume nicotine with very few health effects. So tobacco harm reduction is about facing the fact that many people like nicotine, but it's changing the delivery system so that they don't have to smoke the cigarettes that are killing them. Now, for smoking, the problem is in the product. It's the smoke, the tars that cause the lung diseases. The nicotine itself is a pretty harmless product. So we really need to begin to separate out different kinds of harmful products and encourage people to shift to safer ways of using nicotine. Now, we're familiar with tobacco harm reduction because most people know about nicotine replacement therapy, gums, sprays and so on, things bought in pharmacies so that you can help quit. Nicotine replacement therapy sold really as a treatment, as a medication, and with the long-term aim, or medium-term aim, that people will actually give up the therapy as well. So you move from smoking to using nicotine gum, and then eventually you stop using the gum. So it's an abstinence both from the smoking and an abstinence from nicotine. So we need to begin to think about not nicotine replacement therapies, but perhaps a broader category of nicotine-containing products, separating out the nicotine from the harmful ways of consuming it, i.e. by smoking it. Most people will have heard of e-cigarettes or seen e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes, which have, this is a rather large one, many of them are cigarette lookalikes, but this has a battery in it and has a cell here, a space here where the nicotine fluid goes, and a mouthpiece here, and simply delivers pure nicotine and none of the hazardous substances. Now, there are some problems with e-cigarettes at the moment in terms of where they're made and what else might be in them. There's no, they're not regulated at all. Clearly, with any product like this, which might be used widely, we need to move forward on regulations in terms of product quality, avoiding contaminants in the propellants, and so on, some standards and maybe some safeguards about the containers in which the nicotine is provided, and so on and so forth. And the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority is currently looking at the regulation of e-cigarettes, and I think, my understanding, it's going to come up with some light touch regulation. If only because any form of nicotine other than cigarettes is so many times safer than cigarettes that it's almost a no-brainer that it's hard to regulate these in a tougher way than you currently regulate cigarettes. So it'd be daft to put restrictions on the availability of things like this, even though that has happened in some countries. You can't purchase these in some countries. So we're shifting, I think, to seeing ways in which nicotine might be delivered in various ways. And we're seeing a proliferation of e-cigarette sales online, and there are now e-cigarette shops in some high streets. Some of the big tobacco companies are getting interested in alternative nicotine delivery systems, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, there's another very simple way of ingesting nicotine, and that's through a Swedish product called Snus, where there is pasteurised tobacco in this little pouch, which is placed under the lip, and the nicotine dissolves in the saliva and is ingested. Very popular in Sweden. In fact, in Sweden it's much more popular. Around 20% of Swedish men use snus, and only about 10% of Swedish men smoke tobacco. Using snus in terms of health risks is probably at about the same level as giving up smoking cigarettes altogether. So we have a number of products, they're there, and they're so obvious as a way of helping people to move away from smoking and onto safer ways of consuming nicotine. Now, some people might say, well, if these become more popular, what if younger people find this as a way of using nicotine for the first time? The modelling suggests that even if the whole population were consuming these products, we would have infinitesimal risks from this. So it's not a health risk. There is, of course, a moral issue about whether people should be consuming an addictive substance, but that I think is, well, it's not a big issue for me anymore, that it's an issue if people like to drink a lot of coffee or some other substance, as long as the health risks are absent. So I think we're at the beginning of a stage where there's the initial adoption. There are e-cigarette fans, they call themselves vapors. There are dedicated websites, but I think we're gradually, in the next 5 to 10 years, see a variety of nicotine delivery systems appearing and being adopted. It also, I think, has some interesting prospects about how you deliver harm reduction, because the history of harm reduction generally, particularly in the illicit drugs field, has been delivering services to service users. But with this, you could have a harm reduction intervention which is consumer driven. It doesn't cost the NHS a penny. We've got a wonderful harm reduction model here which is led by and paid for by the people who are doing the harm reduction itself. The other thing that appeals to me in this is that a lot of the tobacco control argument has been anti-tobacco industry. Most tobacco control advocates have seen as one of their objectives the end of the tobacco industry. That there will come a day when there are no longer tobacco companies. I think that is just hopelessly optimistic, although it's a sentiment with which I'd agree. We need to create a situation in which there are incentives for tobacco companies to gradually become nicotine companies, that they need to see that their own long-term profits are going to be in other products than in cigarettes, that they need to diversify their risk. Tobacco, cigarettes, decline in market, other nicotine markets. That actually gives them a legitimate escape or development route as a company. You know, they are still in business, but they're transforming over the next few decades into companies which produce nicotine in different ways. This is relevant to rich countries, but it's also very relevant to developing countries, and especially those countries lower and lower middle income countries where other forms of tobacco ingestion are popular. For example, in India, the predominant form of tobacco ingestion is through chewing tobacco, but it's not the same kind of tobacco as snus. It actually has risks attached to it in terms of oral and pancreatic cancers. The thing about snus is that it's been pasteurised, so many of the toxic ingredients have been removed from it. So for many countries, getting tobacco companies interested in marketing safer forms of oral tobacco could bring huge public health benefits. But we've got a huge health problem staring us in the face with tobacco and some pretty simple solutions. So I'm actually very optimistic about the changes that might be occurring in this field. And I'd really like to press my harm reduction colleagues to get interested in tobacco harm reduction as well as harm reduction for all the other substances.